Happy 32nd week in Ordinary Time, everyone. Normally I put an audio version of my homily online, but because of some technical difficulties this week, I did not get an adequate recording. So instead, I've decided to make the sort of video version of my homily for those who would like to hear or requested a copy of it. Over here at the university for the past 6 years or so, we've been doing every Thursday night with the students movie night. Each semester there's a theme of the films that we will watch. This semester we've been watching the films, or certain films, that over the course of the years have won Best Picture, the Academy Awards. So last week we watched the 1966 film A Man for All Seasons, which tells the story of St. Thomas More. Most of you know the story. He was the Chancellor of England under King Henry VIII. And when Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife and marry another, and the Holy Father would not give him permission, the king decided to start his own church and demand that everyone under his reign, his officials, would sign a document saying that they would follow him as the head of the Church of England. And St. Thomas More, because he was a man of conscience, refused to do so, and as a result was thrown into prison and ultimately executed. After watching that film, I thought of the readings, or at least the first reading from the Old Testament this week, from the book of Maccabees, which tells the story of the 7 brothers who gave their life rather than break God's commandments. If you know the historical situation of the Maccabees, it took place about 160 years before Jesus, during the time when some pagan rulers were governing in Israel at the time and trying to force the Jews, to follow certain pagan practices. They were trying to Hellenize the Jews, including making them eat pork in order to push back against what they believed. And of course, here we have the 7 brothers who would rather die and be tortured rather than act against the law of God and of their consciences. So really realized how similar Thomas More and the 7 brothers were in the fact that these individuals were men of conscience, men of courage, very, very steadfastly holding to what they believed, their religious and moral convictions. And knowing with the election coming up made me sort of think, where do we find people like that today? Men and women of conscience, men and women of courage, and men and women of character. And so that's sort of what we want to reflect upon, or what I did reflect upon. This issue of character, of conscience, in regards to the individuals who run for public office in our nation. Not just for the presidential election, but for any election. How do we as Catholics see these things, and how should it affect our voting? And so there are a few things that we know that our bishops have spoken about that should be non-negotiables, the most important issues when it comes to voting for individuals who are running for public office. Of course, we're going to have life issues. Those are very, very important. We also have the issues of marriage and the family. And by now, hopefully, everybody knows how important these issues are and how we should use them to sort of judge the suitability of the candidates who are running for office. But this year, particularly with the presidential election, a lot of people are saying, okay, I know these things to be true, but what about the issue of moral character? How should we evaluate that when it comes to choosing candidates for public office in whatever election? What part should it play in our decision, in our voting? And so I want to offer a few points on that. And these are points that I really think nobody is going to deny, or at least you shouldn't deny. The first is this, that there is no such thing as a perfectly morally virtuous and morally outstanding candidate. Every single one of them has a flaw, or many flaws, in fact. All of them have skeletons in their closet. There's no such thing as a candidate who sort of descended from heaven in this idealized state that everyone can agree is going to be perfect. All individuals, all candidates have some type of a flaw. The second thing is we realize that we're not voting for Pope here. We're not looking for someone of such perfect moral holiness or goodness that maybe one day they would be canonized a saint. Quite often, people who are such holy individuals often don't make very, very good leaders. This is evidence at certain times in history. And then finally, though, recognizing the other extreme, we can't completely disregard the importance of moral uprightness and moral character when it comes to voting for individuals. Otherwise, we're going to vote someone in who is completely and totally corrupt or has such moral decrepitude that they would make a terrible leader. And I think that's the point that we really want to focus on, particularly in relation to the examples that I mentioned of St. Thomas More and of the seven brothers we hear about in the first reading from the book of Maccabees today. If we're going to focus on one word that should be important, it is going to be corrupt. We hear so often about these corrupt politicians and these corrupt individuals who are running for office at different levels in our country. The word corrupt actually comes from two Latin words, corrumpere, which means a total break or a complete break. A person who is corrupt is willing to be broken or is broken. They're willing to take money, to be bribed, to be threatened, to work for their own personal self-interest. So in a certain sense, corruption is the opposite of the word integrity. Integrity comes from the Latin words which mean to be whole, to be untouched. So a person who has integrity has a sort of a moral wholeness, while the individual who is corrupt is broken. And we see that St. Thomas More refused to be broken. He stood fast to his moral conscience, to what he believed. And the same thing, you could torture the seven brothers, but they refused to be broken. They refused to be bought off. They refused to be bribed or cajoled. And so this sort of incorruptibility, there's of course never a perfect incorruptibility, but to look for candidates or to judge them not only for their stance on certain important issues, but for whether or not we believe that they have a certain incorruptibility, that they refuse to be broken, that they are willing to stand by their conscience. Now, of course, no one is going to do this perfectly, but I think it becomes a very good criterion for us to use when evaluating candidates for public office. We can't expect them to be completely perfect. We can't expect them to be complete saints. We can use this as one of the criterion we use when making our decision on whom to vote for. But there's something else in the readings that we see or we heard over the course of the weekend that I'd like to bring up. If we're going to sort of look at all of the readings, there's a certain theme that runs through them all. And I think it's going to be the theme of heaven. That what we are really supposed to be focused on are not the things of this world, not temporalities, but heaven. The fact that we're going to have a resurrected body. The fact that we are going to be with the Lord. And so often it's easy for us to forget that. We get so caught up in worldly realities, and we get so distraught and disconcerted about these things, and we forget that our eyes should really be focused on the world to come. We care for the earth, we care for creation, we care for the things and the happenings that go on in our daily life, we work for justice and we work for peace, but ultimately we need to be focused on the kingdom of heaven. And therefore, I think it makes a good examination of conscience that we, particularly in our world today and as Americans, can quite often put too much emphasis on politics and on the political, where we think that the political sphere is going to take care of all of our problems if we have the right laws or if we have the right people in public office. So we focus more on the political rather than on the moral and rather than on the spiritual, rather than on the heavenly. The natural above the supernatural. We know this. We should not place our trust in princes. There's not going to be any president or any senator or any congressman who is going to bring about this utopia, who's going to bring about this perfect state of affairs. We cannot put our hope in these individuals, but quite often we Americans tend to do that. Decades ago, Bishop Fulton Sheen, who many of you know from television and radio, gave a very powerful quote on this, and it's something that I think still should speak to us today. And I'm reading here. He talks about how Americans tend to stress politics so much that our concept of goodness and badness, of moral right and wrongness, shifts from the moral realm to the political realm. Listen to what he has to say. He says, passions, deep loyalties, which once were linked with one's view of God, morals, religion, now revolve around parties, points of view, and power groups. The result is Americans get mad about the wrong things. And believe me, as a priest, I've seen this to be true, particularly around election time. People come to me so angry, so frustrated, often despondent at the situation, saying, I hate the way our country is going, or I hate the way our state, our local government's going because of these politicians and all the terrible things that are happening. Yes, we need to be interested, we need to get involved, but the thing is, we cannot lose our peace. And if we keep our eyes focused on the next life, if we keep our hearts set on heaven, then we're going to make the right decisions, but we're not going to put our trust in politics, and we're going to be able to keep that sense of peace, that sense of moral and spiritual quiet, realizing that no matter what happens on this earth, that our eyes are focused on the kingdom of heaven. And in fact, we believe that a lot of this lack of peace, a lot of this involvement in politics is actually generated by the media. They want us to watch. They want us to get angry. They want us to get worried, because what does that do? That makes us watch their shows more, and it increases their revenue. We're being used for that. We should not allow our peace to be disturbed. Keep up with what's going on, but if we find that we can't sleep, our blood pressure is going up, turn off the news and watch something else, or go play in the yard, or go pray, or do something like that. So in conclusion, there are 3 things that I would like you to consider before you go to vote this year or in any year. And not just in the presidential election, we're talking about any election where we are considering casting a vote for individuals for public office. The first thing is this: do not forget the most important issues, the non-negotiables, issues that deal with life, marriage, the family, freedom of conscience, and to know what these issues are and to know where the candidates stand on these issues. The second thing is this: let's focus on this idea of incorruptibility. Which candidate do we think has the least chance of being corrupt? The one that has the most moral integrity and moral wholeness and is not going to be broken by special interests or by bribes or by threats or these types of things. The one that has the most moral integrity and is the least corrupt, as it were. And then third and finally, to make that question to ourselves: are we putting too much emphasis and too much hope in the political and in politics and political leaders, rather than keeping our sights set on heaven and our firm belief in the person of Jesus Christ? I think if we can consider and keep in mind these 3 things, then our experience on Election Day will hopefully be a lot better, and that we can pray and hope for the will of God to be achieved in our nation and in our world. God bless.